Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Psalm 34, and that's where we'll begin here in just a moment. Psalm 34. It's good to see each one here and looking forward to our study together tonight. In Psalm 34, and there in verse 7. Psalm 34, and there in verse 7, it says, "The angel of Yahweh, or the angel of the Lord, encamps around those who fear him and rescues them." Over the years in preaching, one of the questions that is repeated, has been oft asked is, what do you think about the angel of the Lord? And that question comes from a number of different directions. Most of the time it's, who is it? And then maybe some other questions about the nature of the angel of the Lord. And I usually answer those questions as we frequently do, saying, here are some things we can know for sure. Here are some things that I don't know. And here are some things that I speculate. And usually what I get is, I think that's probably the same. I think the same as you do, but I don't know why. And I don't know either, or at least I haven't had good answers for why I think those things. But in preparing for our studies in Joshua and Judges and the appearance of the angel of the Lord in those studies, I was motivated to sort of go and turn the attention fully on this character, the angel of the Lord, and try to know what we can know and be more certain about what can be known and more certain maybe even about what can't be known and what conclusions can be drawn about what I think is a pretty important character in Scripture. I want to begin by just making some surface observations. And the first one is that the angel of the Lord shows up a lot. And I mean a whole lot. And I think he shows up in places and in ways where he's easy to miss because of the way that he talks, which is a point that we'll make in just a moment. We already read here in Psalm 34 in verse 7 where he is mentioned here in a litany of praises to Yahweh. He is mixed into those praises as the angel of the Lord doing this, encamping around those who fear him and rescues them. The same way he is mentioned again in the next psalm, in Psalm 35 and verse 5. Let them be chaffed before the wind with the angel of Yahweh driving them on. But if we back up and we begin at the beginning of Scripture, the first occasion where the angel of the Lord is explicitly mentioned is the story of Hagar. And that's in Genesis chapter 16. And you remember after Sarah had suggested this plan with Hagar and she had conceived and born a son, then Sarah became angry and she drove Hagar out. And this is the first place where the angel of the Lord is the one who appears to her and comforts her and tells her to go back to her mistress. Then again in chapter 21, when Isaac is born, and now there's conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, and again, Ishmael's driven out and Hagar along with him, and again the Lord appears, the angel of the Lord appears, and again gives her promises and comforts even after she's been driven out. So it's interesting to me that in all of Scripture, the first two places that he appears is to speak to this servant woman who is an outcast, both in Genesis 16 and 21. Well, it's not long before he appears again over in chapter 22. This is one of those places where I think it's easy to overlook the appearance of the angel of the Lord. When Abraham had gone and taken Isaac up on the mountain and was about to sacrifice Isaac as he has been commanded, it is the angel of the Lord that appears and stays the hand, that tells Abraham not to kill Isaac. Now, when we tell that story, usually we wouldn't say the angel of the Lord appeared. We would just say God said. But it's the angel of the Lord who spoke. And I think that it's important to note those sorts of instances. Over in chapter 24 then, in Genesis chapter 24, as Abraham is directing his servant to go up and to find Rebekah, to find a wife for his son Isaac, he says that the angel of the Lord would go with him, that Yahweh's angel would accompany him on that trip. Over in chapter 31 then is the next appearance. In chapter 31, Jacob has been working for Laban for all these many years, and at this time is told to make the departure. It is the angel of the Lord that appears to Jacob in a dream and tells him to get away from Laban to go back down to the land of Canaan. That's all of the explicit appearances. We'll talk about some implicit appearances a little bit later. But in the book of Genesis, that's all the times that the angel of the Lord is mentioned as appearing. However, in Exodus chapter 3, another occasion that I forget that the angel of the Lord is mentioned. But when Moses sees the bush that is burning, it says the angel of the Lord was there. That's the angel of the Lord there in that presence. And so that's who he comes in contact with and who speaks to him at the sight of the burning bush, the angel of the Lord. In chapter 14, as the children of Israel are departing from Egypt, we are told that it is the angel of the Lord that is in the cloud of presence that goes from before the people and comes back around to the rear of the people. And that is, in fact, other places he is frequently mentioned as being in the cloud of presence. So as we think about that cloud of presence that leads the people, the angel of the Lord is associated frequently with that cloud of presence. Over in Exodus chapter 23, Exodus chapter 23, and in verse 23, Moses says there, and really, let's back up to verse 20. It says, "Behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to keep you along the way and to bring you into the place which I've prepared. Keep watch of yourself before him and listen to his voice, and do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, since my name is in him. But if you truly listen to his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will annihilate them." And so it doesn't say the angel of the Lord, but it is Yahweh speaking. And then he then calls this leading angel his angel. As you go over to chapter 32, in Exodus 32, after they have failed in their loyalty to God by worshiping the golden calf, it says in verse 34 that God says, "Go now, guide the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I punish, I will punish them for their sins." So as God is sort of telling them, just go on, my angel will be with you. And then we see further as you go on into the text, he indicates he would not. He would stay back. And then Moses has that conversation with God. Well, that's the occasions that really stand out, at least, in the book of Exodus. Coming then over to the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 22, of course, this is the lone appearance of the angel of the Lord. And it is when Balaam is, of course, on his way to go to Balak and to prophesy for him. And the angel of the Lord is standing in the way, and that's the occasion where the donkey is trying to get out of the way. And finally, he presents himself there to Balaam, shows himself to Balaam, has that conversation with him, and we see his holding the sword ready to bring judgment on Balaam for his disobedience. Judges chapter 2 is a place where we noted the presence of the angel of the Lord in our class this morning. And this is the first of several appearances in the book of Judges. But there in Judges chapter 2, it is the angel of the Lord that appears from Gilgal to Bochim to come and pronounce this judgment on the people for their failure to drive out the Canaanites. But then the angel of the Lord is mentioned in Judges chapter 5 in the Song of Deborah. In verse 23, curse Meroz, it says, "Said the angel of Yahweh, utterly curse its inhabitants because they did not come to the help of Yahweh against the warriors. And so again, we have a reference not to Yahweh himself, but to the angel of Yahweh. Over in chapter 6, beginning really in chapter 6, it is the angel of the Lord that so often communicates with Gideon. Beginning in verse 11, the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to preserve it from the Midianites. And it continues on, of course, it's lengthy conversations between the angel of the Lord and Gideon. Then finally, in the book of Judges, over in chapter 13, in Judges chapter 13, we have the appearance of the angel of the Lord to the parents of Samson, announcing the birth of Samson. And he appears a couple of times. First of all, he appears to Samson's mother, and then she goes and tells her husband about it, and then he appears again, and she's able to go get her husband, and he comes, and he is able to see the angel of the Lord and ask even more questions than have already been answered about Samson's coming. And so he appears all of these times throughout the book of Judges. Well, then over in 2 Samuel chapter 24. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, this is one of the accounts given of the consequences of the census that David made. We see the same thing over in the Chronicles account. But in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and in verse 16, as David has put himself directly into the hands of Yahweh, that's the punishment he's chosen. Yahweh sent a pestilence there in verse 15. And then it says, then the angel sent forth his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it. And Yahweh relented of the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, it is enough. Now relax your hand. And the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh, was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And then we have another occasion in 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19, after the kingdom has divided, and in the time of Elijah, after his standoff with the prophets of Baal, his life is sought by Jezebel, you recall there. And in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 7, as he is fleeing from Jezebel, it says, the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh, came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. And he would continue on down to Mount Horeb, where the Lord would speak to him there. Over in 2 Kings chapter 1, in 2 Kings chapter 1 and in verse 3, the angel of the Lord again appears to to Elijah. The angel of Yahweh said to Elijah the Tishbite, arise and go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Well, then over in 2 Kings chapter 19, in 2 Kings chapter 19 and in verse 35, 2 Kings 19 and in verse 35, on this occasion, and again, this is recorded in other places. We see it again in the Chronicles. We see it actually in Isaiah repeated. But it says it happened that night that the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And so that occasion where the Assyrians have come to the gates, and in Hezekiah's day, he appeals to the Lord, and it is the angel of the Lord who provides the deliverance, striking down those 185,000 men of Assyria. Well, a couple of mentions in the prophets then, over in Isaiah chapter 37. In Isaiah chapter 37, and there in verse 36. Isaiah 37 and in verse 36, it says, then the angel of Yahweh, that's another occasion there of that recording, went out and struck the 185,000 in the camp. But then again in chapter 63, Isaiah 63 and in verse 9, It says, in all their distress, he was distressed, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his mercy, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the ancient days. But they rebelled and grieved. And so as it's recording the history, it refers to the saving agent as this angel of the Lord. Finally, over in Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 1. In Zechariah chapter 1 and in verse 11, it says, so they answered the angel of Yahweh who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth is sitting still and quiet. And that really begins a conversation that continues with the angel of the Lord. It continues and comes on into, and we're reminded that it is the angel of the Lord that is present in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, where it says, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Yahweh, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And we'll come back and look more at that in a little bit. But those are most of, not all of, but most of the appearances of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. Now, already, is that more than you would have thought? It's more than I would have thought. It's more than I have. If you'd have even mentioned some of these and say, how does the angel of the Lord appear here? I would say, now I'm not sure if he's there or not. Because again, I think we immediately go to that God is speaking. And of course, that is the first and maybe most important observation to make, is that he is Yahweh. Right? Whoever he is, in some form or fashion, the angel of the Lord is speaking as Yahweh. And doing that in a number of different ways that you could think about. Back in chapter 16 of Genesis, where we were looking a moment ago at the story of, looking at the story of Hagar there. In verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's servant woman, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hands. Moreover, the angel of Yahweh said, I will greatly multiply your seed, so that they will be too many to be counted. Who will do that? The angel of the Lord says, I'll do that. Now, I think we would say, well, now, God's the one that's going to. Yes, exactly. God is the one that's going to do that. And the angel of the Lord is claiming that sort of power. He goes on, the angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you're with child, you'll bear a son. She'll call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction. He will be a donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He'll dwell in the face of all his brothers. Then she called the name of Yahweh, who spoke to her. Let me make a point here. It doesn't say she called the name Yahweh, who she thought was speaking to her. It says she called the name Yahweh, who was speaking to her. That's Moses saying that's who was speaking to her. And so then it goes on, you are a God who sees. For she said, I have even remained here alive after seeing him. Well, again, over in chapter 22 of Genesis, chapter 22, and they're picking up in verse 11, the angel of the Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the boy and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Not from him, but from me. And then Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there was a ram after being caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, Yahweh will provide, as it is to this day. In the mount of Yahweh it will be provided. Then the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn. Whew. You couldn't get more definitive, as far as, some people will say an angel is a messenger. Absolutely. Angel is a spokesperson. Absolutely. But this is an angel who doesn't speak just for God, but who speaks as God. By myself, right? He is swearing by himself. This is one of the whole points is as the Hebrew writer is at pains to distinguish angels from God, like God swears by himself. Angels do not. And this is an angel who is saying, I swear by myself, because you have done this thing and have not spared your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens. Well, over in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2, of course, as we mentioned before, the angel of Yahweh is the one who appeared to him in a blazing fire in the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So it's the angel of the Lord appearing, and it's the angel of the Lord speaking. And what does the angel of the Lord say? First of all, it says, it shifts, and this is often the case in these narratives. It shifts to just calling Yahweh the one who's speaking, right? So it's the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh who's appeared. But in verse 4, Yahweh saw that he turned aside to look. So God called him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. And as he goes on, of course, here is the place where not only does God speak in ways about what he will do, but he introduces even his name. And so the angel of the Lord is speaking and says, I am. That's who he claims to be here. And so another instance of claiming that deity. Well, of course, then in the passage that we looked at this morning in the book of Judges chapter 2 in our Bible class, in Judges chapter 2 beginning verse 1, the angel of the Lord, angel of Yahweh, came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. As for you, you shall cut no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall not tear down their altars, but you have not listened to my voice. This is what you have done. Now, I thought the covenant was with Yahweh, not the angel of Yahweh. Well, I would just say, yes, it was with Yahweh. And whoever this is, he is speaking in those kinds of terms, that he is the covenant God of Israel. Well, all of that, and yet there is a distinction. So he is Yahweh, but there is a distinction from Yahweh. And we see that in several places. We see some distinctions being made, one of which is by implication. Back in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 13, at the conclusion of that interaction with Hagar, you recall she said, I've seen God and yet still live. This is one of the things that you frequently see in the appearance of the angel of the Lord, is that people are afraid they're going to die because they've just seen God. Samson's parents thought the same thing. Why would they think that? Well, of course, that's what God has said about himself, is that's the sort of thing. That's what he tells Moses. You can't fully see my appearance. And so there's something distinct about this appearance of Yahweh that is not the same as what that Yahweh tells Moses that he cannot endure, that even Moses himself would die, much less anybody else who came into that presence. Well, over in 2 Samuel chapter 24, as we read about the angel of the Lord being this destroying agent hovering over Jerusalem, and there at the field of Arona, and it says, notice there again in the text, it tells us that Yahweh commanded him to relent. Yahweh told him not to destroy. So Yahweh is speaking to the angel of Yahweh. So here's the angel of Yahweh saying he is Yahweh. And now we have Yahweh speaking to the angel of Yahweh. So there's some distinction to be made. Even more so over here in Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 1 and in verse 12, it says, the angel of Yahweh answered and said, O Yahweh of hosts. All right, so in 2 Samuel 24, we've got Yahweh talking to the angel of Yahweh. Now we have the angel of Yahweh speaking to Yahweh. He said, O Yahweh of hosts, how long will you have no compassion for Jerusalem and the cities of Judah with which you have been indignant these 70 years? Yahweh answered the angel who was speaking with me with good words, comforting words. So we have conversations that are happening back and forth. Well, here's some just on the surface observations. He appears a lot. He talks like he is God, and yet he also has conversations with God. Now, before we go any further, would you say that's enough to make him a pretty significant character in the Bible? Yeah, I'd say that's enough to grab some attention. Usually, again, he sort of fades into the background because he's introduced at the beginning of a story as the angel of the Lord, and then that title gets dropped, and now we're just talking about the Lord, and so that's one of the reasons he fades. And then also maybe he fades because we're just not sure exactly what to do with it, because God is not an angel, and yet here is someone described as an angel who is speaking like he is God, and so what do we do with that? I think this is someone who demands some attention from good Bible students. Well, let's make then some deeper observations. The first of which is that in addition to those places where the angel of the Lord is explicitly described in that way, I think there's some places where we can imply that the angel of the Lord, or something very like it, has also appeared. So one of those instances is in Genesis chapter 18. And if you had asked me for a listing of the places the angel of the Lord is said to have appeared, I would have said this one. But it doesn't use that language. It does, however, say at the beginning, Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. That is, of course, Abraham. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing nearby. He saw, and he ran from the tent door to meet them, and he bowed himself to the earth. And of course, this is the occasion where Abraham invites them to a meal. And as you continue on in Genesis chapter 18, it goes from Abraham talking with a man to Abraham is talking with God. And it's the same person, right? It's not like it's like that man goes away and then in comes God. It just fades into that. So it goes from 3 men to God and 2 angels. And the angels are the destroying angels as we come into chapter 19 that are going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy it. And so I think, as we'll see from some other passages and some other descriptions, that we can make a reasonable speculation, a reasonable assumption here, inference, if you will, that this is also the angel of the Lord. Over in Genesis chapter 31, Genesis chapter 31, one of the places we mentioned earlier that explicitly says the angel of the Lord appeared is in Genesis 31. He comes to Jacob in a dream, but notice what Jacob says. He says in verse 11, the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see all the male goats. He says in verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your kin. And so here's the angel of the Lord appearing to Jacob and saying, do you remember what happened back in Genesis 28? What happened back there at Bethel? That was me. So we can sort of assume then that is an appearance of the angel of the Lord back in chapter 28. Well, then again, as we move into the next chapter, in chapter 32, this is the chapter, of course, towards the end in verse 24, where Jacob sees a man. He wrestles with that man, and it turns out that that man is God. You see that by the end of that story. Well, then Hosea comes and says Jacob wrestled with an angel. And so he describes that as an angel. So here's an appearance of God that is an appearance of a man that another inspired writer says is also an angel. I think it's reasonable to say angel of the Lord there in Genesis chapter 32 in the wrestling with Jacob. Over in Genesis 48 is an interesting inference, I think, or implication. In Genesis 48 and verse 15, as Jacob is blessing the sons of Joseph, it says, he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd throughout my life to this day, just tuck that one away, my shepherd, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless these boys. And may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, may they grow into the multitude in the midst of the earth. And so in the midst of saying, I want the God that I've served to bless these boys, he refers to that God as the angel who has delivered me. And so I think Jacob here is referring to the angel that has appeared to him, who also he has identified in Genesis 32 as God himself. Over in Joshua chapter 5, we talked about this when we were coming through the book of Joshua. In Joshua chapter 5, it says in verse 13, it happened when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? He says, no, rather, I am indeed come now as commander of the host of Yahweh. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his slave? Now, I just want to add one extra element here. He bowed down, and the angel does not say, the angel of Yahweh does not say what the angel says to John in Revelation. Do not worship me. Rather, he says the very words that were spoken to Moses back in Exodus chapter 3, remove your sandals, for you are on holy ground. And so far from going, whoa, don't worship me, he leans into the worship and says, you're right, and you need even more reverence. Take off your shoes. And so associates himself, of course, there with the angel of the Lord back in chapter 3. But not only does he associate himself back there to chapter 3 with that language, I would just add over in Daniel chapter 8, in Daniel chapter 8 and in verse 11, here where there is this little horn that is raising itself up, it says, and we're not going to get all into that. Boy, did you talk about a rabbit trail. We'll try not to follow any of those. We got enough to deal with. But here's this little horn that's raising itself up. It says it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. I believe the commander of the host is talking about deity. And I think that's what this little horn is raising himself up to. That's the same phrase back here that's used in Joshua when he says, I'm the commander of the host. Only he adds the host of Yahweh. And so I think this is another appearance of the angel of the Lord. Over in Daniel chapter 3, just a few chapters back there, we have this occasion where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the furnace. And after that happens, Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 24, was it not 3 men we cast tied up in the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, certainly, O king. And he answered and said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods, or like the Son of God, some of your translations will say. Or, if you look at the Septuagint, it actually says, like the angel of God, which is fascinating. And we'll get to that a little bit more. I think one of the things that you find in the Septuagint is, in addition to translations, sometimes they do some interpreting. And I think that's what they're doing right here, is that the interpreters of the Septuagint are going, oh, there he is. That's the angel of the Lord. And so they're identifying who they already think that is. And I think it's actually a good identification that is another appearance of the angel of the Lord. And we'll talk about maybe some more reasons why as we go along. Well, as we take in those extended sightings of the angel of the Lord, some more observations can be made. One is that he appears as a man. Now, not always, but there are places where he appears as a man, certainly in Genesis 32 and Joshua 5. If Genesis 18 is the angel of the Lord, then there's another occasion. If Daniel 3 is the angel of the Lord, there's another occasion. So he is someone who is God, but presents as a man. Now, I don't think that means that he is incarnated. Let me be very careful to make that clear, because that becomes important a little bit later on if you're already getting ahead of me here. But I do think that is the way he appears, and he appears with substance as a man. You know, they interact with him. For instance, in chapter 32 is the wrestling that goes on with this man. So it's not some intangible corporal appearance, but rather physically present representation of God as a man. Well, he's also given names, just for instance, and there's several places we could go to kind of press in on this point, but just to give you one example, in Judges chapter 13 is a second occasion on which he's asked his name. Remember, the first was back in Genesis 32. Jacob asked him what his name was, and he just refused to tell him, and then Jacob figures it out. And we see that as he calls the name of that place a reference to God. In Judges 13, the parents of Samson also ask what the name of this angel of the Lord is. And the angel, it says, angel of Yahweh said to them, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" Over in Isaiah 9 and in verse 6, Isaiah 9 and verse 6, it's a familiar passage to us. It says, "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." In the Septuagint, it says his name will be called the Messenger of the Wonderful Counsel, or of the Great Counsel. Or it's the word angel, the angel of the great counsel. Again, I think what the Septuagint is doing there is not doing a one-for-one translation from the Hebrew into Greek, but rather they are doing some of the interpreting that the Jewish leaders were already doing, that they thought that this reference here was to the angel of the Lord. And of course, the wonderful would connect us back there to Judges chapter 13 and verse 18. Another characteristic that we see over in Zechariah that we looked at earlier is that he is an intercessor. In Zechariah chapter 1 and in verse 12, it will be at that time, that's Zephaniah. Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 12. Then the angel of the Lord answered and said, "O Yahweh of hosts, how long will you have no compassion for Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, with which you have been indignant these 70 years? He is pleading the case of the people. Down in chapter 3 and beginning in verse 1. Chapter 3 beginning in verse 1. We referenced this earlier, but continuing on, it showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And Yahweh said to Satan, Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, Yahweh who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand delivered from the fire? Now, Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and standing before the angel. And he answered and spoke to those who were standing before him, saying, remove the filthy garments from him. And again he said to him, see, I have made your iniquity pass away from you, and will clothe you with festal robes. Then I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, while the angel of the Lord was standing by. And the angel of the Lord testified to Joshua, saying, thus says Yahweh of hosts, if you will walk in my ways and you'll keep the responsibility given by me, then you will also render justice in my house, and also keep my courts, and I will grant you access to walk among those who are standing here. So here in this cleansing of Joshua, the high priest, the representative of the people, who is it that is performing that function? But the angel of the Lord there is going through the process of cleansing this representative of God's people who is clothed in the filthy rags. So we see him performing that role of intercessor, both in communicating to God and then in actually making the people clean, making the representative of the people clean. One more possible reference that I would like to note is in Malachi chapter 1, or chapter 3 rather, Malachi chapter 3. It says there in Malachi 3 and verse 1, "Behold, I'm going to send my messenger." Now, one of the things that I've alluded to, but haven't spoken much about, is the word angel and messenger, same word, right? If you see the word messenger, it's probably the word for angel, vice versa. Same thing in the New Testament and the Old Testament, in fact. And so that same word here, I'm going to send my messenger or angel, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Now stop right there. So far, the preparing messenger, we know that that's John the Baptist. We understand that. But notice the second, the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says Yahweh of hosts. And so, again, here is, I think, another way of referencing the angel of the Lord or the messenger of the Lord of the covenant, that not only is this kind of messenger coming, but he's preparing the way for this other messenger of the Lord who will come and bring delight to his people. All right. There's so much more we could talk about already before we even go to the New Testament, which is what we're about to do. But I want to say this. I'm saving you lots of quotations from a lot of Jewish thinkers. But at the turn of the millennium, as we come into the time of Christ, Jewish writings had already broadly come to grips with there are two persons in the Godhead. There are two Yahwehs in the Old Testament. And there's this presence of the Lord, this angel of Yahweh, and then of course there's the Yahweh that he speaks to and has conversations with. So there's something going on. And then after Jesus appeared, they tried to get rid of all references to any of those notions. Why would they do that? Why would they all of a sudden think, I don't want this doctrine of two Yahwehs to be recognized as valid anymore, and let's shove that to the side? I believe it's because, and I hope you're already there, Jesus fits the bill on a lot of these descriptions of the angel of the Lord. There's so many things that we say about him can be said about Jesus. When we talk about him being God and yet distinct from God, when we talk about him obviously being wonderful, that's obviously who's being spoken of in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. When we talk about him being a deliverer, we talk about him being the intercessor, we talk about him being the one who brings clean robes to his people. All of those things are true. He fills all of those roles that the angel of the Lord is filling. His very appearing to man. You know, when Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's what's happening when the angel of the Lord appears, isn't it? Right? That they're saying, we've seen Yahweh because we saw the angel of Yahweh. Isn't that what Jesus is saying about himself throughout the New Testament? But I think that we can be more explicit even than that. Look over at Acts chapter 7. In Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 30, Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 30, it says, this is in the midst of Stephen's sermon, relating so much of the history of Israel. And as he comes down to Moses, in verse 30, he says, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him, to Moses, in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of the burning bush. We've already read about that. When Moses saw it, he was marveling at the sight. And as he approached to look more closely, there came the voice of the Lord. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and would not dare to look. But the Lord said to him, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their groans, and I have come down to deliver them, and I will send you to Egypt. Then Moses, whom they disowned, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one whom God sent to be both a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Now, remember back in Exodus 23 and verse 23 when it says, I will send my angel before you. And now Stephen is saying the helper, that angel that is helping Moses in the delivery, that's the same angel that appeared to him in the burning bush, and that he's the helper here. And he goes on, this man led them out doing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and the Red Sea and the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the sons of Israel, God will raise up for you a prophet like me, from your brothers. This is the one who in the congregation in the wilderness was with the angel who was speaking to him on Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received living oracles to pass on to you. The word of the Lord being delivered to Moses by the angel of the Lord is the way Stephen interprets that. Well, Numbers chapter 20 and in verse 16 makes a reference to this. This is one of the references that we did not note as we were going through. Numbers chapter 20, and there in verse 16, it says, so we cried out to Yahweh, he heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Now behold, we are at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. This is as he's communicating with Edom. All right, now look over at the book of Jude. Jude verse 5. Jude writes, I want to remind you, though you know all things, that Jesus, having once saved a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. Who delivered Israel? Well, you say, well, God delivered Israel. What if somebody got up and said, Jesus brought his people out of Egypt? Well, okay, but that's not technically, no, that's what he says. Jesus did that. And that is the very same language that's being used about this angel who appeared at the burning bush, and then who they cried out and Moses says was a deliverer, and then who Stephen points back and says, you rejected Moses, though the angel of the Lord appeared to him, the angel spoke to him. You've got all this connection between Moses and the angel. Can I suggest to you the impact if their rejection, as he is preaching through and he's making the case of the rejection, you didn't just reject Moses, you rejected the angel who was by his side. And isn't the point of the sermon at the end that they're still rejecting that very angel? The very one who we can't make separations, you see. They would like to do that. Say, well, then we don't reject the God who delivered us from Egypt. The very one, Jesus himself. That is who you are rejecting. And so Jesus is not a character who pops onto the scene in the New Testament. I know we know that because we talk about before the foundations of the world, we have all that. But what if he has been one of the most active characters throughout the Old Testament, and when we get to the rejection in the New Testament, they are rejecting the one who's been there the whole time by their side, actually in real fashion by their side. What an even greater condemnation when they come to reject him. I would make one more observation about looking back from the New Testament perspective. I realize that the angel of the Lord is not mentioned per se, except for instance in this sermon in Acts chapter 7. But as you look in Matthew chapter 17, you know the story there. the transfiguration. So here is Jesus on the mountain with Peter and James and John, these three who go up to the mountain, and they see Jesus who begins to shine brightly. And then they see Moses and Elijah standing next to Jesus in this bright shining. And of course, the voice of the Father who says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him." It tells us in Luke's account, to add an additional element to this, it says in verse 29, this is Luke chapter 9, verse 29, "It happened that while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different. His clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure." I'm sure you remember we've made this point before. Departure here is the Greek word exodus. Speaking of his exodus, which he was about to fulfill at Jerusalem. All right. Now, if you go back to the story in Judges, you'll see that that's one of the places where he doesn't appear as a man. In fact, he appears in glory, and that's one of the reasons they're so afraid, the parents of Samson. He appears like the angel of the Lord, right? So he has that angelic appearance. You see in Daniel as he sees. You see in Ezekiel the way that he describes that presence there. But Daniel especially, the description lines up very well with the description that we see in Revelation. I think that what we see when Jesus appears in those ways in the Old Testament, that he's appearing not in his incarnate form, not the way he would have appeared born as a babe, raised as a man, all of those things, but appears like he appears in the book of Revelation, right? The curtain pulled back, the flesh pulled back. What does Jesus really look like? Glorious, shining, bright. Turn your face away. So here, I think these men get an opportunity to see the presence of the Lord on earth in all the glory that is possible to see it in. I think they get to see what Moses and Elijah already saw. And I'll tell you what's more about that. If that's what's happening here, and I think there's good reason to think that is what's happening here, is that his true glory is being revealed, then what happens is Moses, who the angel of the Lord came to in his time of Exodus, and then Elijah, who the angel of the Lord came to in his time of where? Going down to Mount Horeb to feed him bread and water as he was on his way to the mountain of the Lord. Another Exodus story. And now they are appearing to him in his Exodus. And they are getting to have a conversation, not with somebody that they're meeting for the first time, but they are being reunited with the one who has already caused their deliverance. They know him. That makes me want to cry. Can you imagine the increased impact of James and John and Peter getting to see that moment, that reunion? And that is a sight that we all have a promise of. That we all get to see the angel of the Lord. I think no one here needs more reasons to be impressed with Jesus. But I hope everyone loves more reasons to be impressed with Jesus. And that's what this gives me, if nothing else, is that here is a picture of a Savior who has always, he's the one that has always been saving his people. And when he shows up on the pages of our New Testament, it is not because he had to come as a man in order to interact with his people. No. not to deliver his people out of Egypt. He has already done that. He's already been, incidentally, there in Matthew chapter 17, just to add one more thing, the cloud of presence is there as well. He's already been there. He's already done that. But he takes yet still one further step to accomplish it all. What a Savior. And so I hope that we have that thought of the song, more about Jesus would I know. And I hope this is more about Jesus that I would know and be impressed by, and more reasons to fall in love with him and to be loyal to him as that deliverer. But also this, because he appears in Numbers 21 and he appears in Joshua chapter 5 and he appears in those places as he does in the book of Revelation with a sword drawn. He's not only the deliverer of his people, but he is the destroyer of God's enemies. You see, all those things that you see the angel of the Lord doing, he's still doing. You see, he hasn't put down the activity of the angel of the Lord. He has just culminated it. And he still holds salvation and judgment in his hands. How will you stand before him? Will you be the one trembling, knowing that his presence means your death? Or will you be the one who glories in his presence, like Moses and Elijah? I hope that you would come to him. I hope that you would swear your loyalty to him this evening. And if we could help you do that in any way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?